So yeah, we talked a lot about on the podcast. There was a period of about 6 years, partly because of the pandemic, where I never did any flying, and I was super proud of myself for not any of those carbon emissions. But now in the last year, I've done a ton of flying, and so I've had to kind of wrap my brain around that. Should I feel guilty about all this flying? So I listened to a podcast from The Guardian. This is on their Science Weekly podcast. This was around January 16th. This episode came out and was called, "Is Guilt-Free Flying on the Horizon?" The short answer is yes and no. I mean, everyone is working on solutions, of course, for how to fly with fewer carbon emissions. So look up the podcast. I didn't pull any clips, but I made some notes, and I just want to talk about this podcast for a second. But look it up if you're interested in this. They had a guy on who was, kind of an expert in these things, and he's currently flying electric aircraft, which we know from the show is really, at this moment, it's just short haul, often for training. Very, very small aircraft are electric, but this is kind of where we're at for flying. It is going to take quite a while. This is going to be one of the harder things to solve in terms of carbon emissions and climate change. Right now, 2.5% to 7% of the worldwide carbon emissions are from flying. They don't know the exact figure, but sometime, 2.5%
And they're
to 7%.
anticipating a lot more people are going to fly. It's the same reason a lot more people are driving. There's more people in the world going into the middle class, and why should they be restricted to their, where they live? It's
the industry is expanding, for better or for worse. So there's, different ways to tackle this that they talked about in this podcast. Green hydrogen is currently one of the solutions, so it is possible to power an aircraft with green hydrogen. But right now, it's kind of looking like very similar to just battery electric airplanes, that the hydrogen would work best for kind of shorter distances. And, we think that we're going to have maybe battery electric planes that, it sounds like it would be something similar. The problem is going to be those super long flights. So as it is right now, if you've got an airplane, the problem is batteries are too heavy, right? And airplanes have to fly. So, normal jet fuel is 1/50th the weight for the same amount of energy currently for what's available for batteries. And that's why it's not currently practical. So what should we be doing? Well, we should be investing in other things other than flying, more robust rail, high-speed rail. And like they have done in France, we need to do more regulations to basically outlaw any short-haul flying, which, in France, we've talked about this on the show, that if it's something within an hour or two, you're not going to be allowed to have a flight. You're going to have to go by train. So we should be doing more of those kinds of things. They talked about contrails in the sky, and I've never fully kind of understood what the problem is, but when you see a jet flying through the air, of course, sometimes there's big clouds that form because of them, and they're basically artificial clouds. And some of those are worse than others in terms of climate change, and I don't quite understand the science from that, but basically soot from the fuel creates ice crystals, and it sort of interacts with what's in the air to make ice crystals. And some of these are sort of worse in terms of climate change. But the expert on the show thought that this could be addressed with more precise and more accurate weather forecasting. So what he was saying was that you should be able to predict the areas of the sky that are more likely to interact and form these ice crystals and form these artificial clouds. And if we can accurately predict those, well, then we can just reroute the planes so that they don't fly through those areas. And if we can figure that out, that would actually be a massive reduction in terms of the sort of greenhouse gases that airplanes do. So, yeah, I thought this was super interesting. Of course, biofuels is another one, or e-fuels. And, you can make fuel by taking carbon out of the air. You can take the carbon out of the air to make your fuel. And this is definitely a way to do it. You could even maybe make it carbon extra neutral by taking out more carbon than you need to make the fuel. But currently it's way too expensive and difficult. And so maybe that's something on the horizon.
The contrails, I've read pieces about how much they reflect the sun. That there was a difference when the pandemic lockdown happened, and there was measurable increase. Well, one was ships. Remember, we talked about that a couple. That was very interesting.
Yeah.
But also, you know, from airplanes that actually deflects some of the sun. So
Yeah.
I don't know what the balance is, and certainly we need to decarbonize completely.
Yeah.
Improving is great, but you know, I do foresee though, maybe in 40 or 50 years, maybe in my kid's lifetime, where you could take a flight guilt-free, and it would also be cheap because it would be, well, for one thing, there wouldn't be any pilots involved. It would be, unfortunately, there wouldn't be any pilots involved for them, but there would be autonomous. That's very close to happening, I think. Certainly very realistic, and it's practically done by them anyway. And then you get, you know, cheap, free solar in the batteries.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to sum it up. I think guilt-free flying is on the horizon, but more for our kids probably than us, as this is definitely a longer-term thing. But, you know, I was thinking about it, and of course, it's often pointed out that it's the very wealthy that are responsible for a lot of these emissions, because it's the wealthy that fly. But a lot of it is just like people have to fly for their jobs. It's a really common thing, and I wouldn't want people to give up their careers just, you know, to cut down their carbon emissions. Barry, for example, flies a lot. He does great work as a cinematographer. I don't think it makes sense for him to stop doing that just because of the emissions. I know someone who's a comedian, a stand-up comedian in Canada. We're going to talk about comedians later. It's very difficult to make a living as a comedian in Canada. You don't make a lot of money at that, but to make that money, you have to fly to do it. There's no other way. Like, Canada's a massive country. It's, in terms of area, the second largest country in the world. And all of these things, for me to get to Toronto, unless they built a nationwide high-speed rail, flying is the only practical way. It takes 3 days to drive to Toronto. I could drive electric, but it just takes too long. And, flying is the only practical way. And a lot of people have to do it for their jobs. And I wouldn't want them to give up their careers, just because of the carbon emissions.
What if you could take an autonomous vehicle there and it would drive you the whole way, charge the whole way, and you could just read a book and nap? And,
that's a good point, because driving yourself to Toronto takes 3 days. If you're crazy, you can do it in 2 days. But yeah, if it was an autonomous vehicle then that you could sleep in, it's about 30 hours, 32 hours of driving. I would definitely consider that if it was autonomous. Yeah, you could do it a lot faster. Just sleep in the car.
You still have to stop for bathrooms and food, though.
Yeah.
Then you might get cramped for 3 days. It's a long way, so you could look at the scenery.
Yeah. Not ideal, but, solutions on the horizon.
Maybe 20 years from now, that might be something that people do more often. They might take less flights. There might be, at that point, taxes on flights, like heavier, levies because of the carbon pollution on flights to do an alternative, and they might do that. I don't know.
Yeah, and all of that is tied to the economy too. I mean, there's lots of things we could all do to lower our carbon footprint, but those things all affect the economy. And if the economy starts crashing because of that, well, then we're not really going to have enough resources to deal with these climate issues. We need a robust economy to deal with the climate.